Welcome back to the deep dive. It is Saturday, February 21st, 2026. And I have to say, looking at the stack of research papers we have on the desk today, I feel a little bit like we're standing on a fault line. You know that feeling when the ground hasn't moved yet, but the birds have completely stopped singing?
That is a very specific and slightly ominous way to start a Saturday morning. But looking at the data from the last few weeks, I really can't say you're wrong.
It's the sheer density of what's happening right now. We aren't just seeing new product launches anymore. We are seeing a fundamental restructuring of how the entire digital world is built. I've seen this term floating around in some of the research notes you sent over the convergence epoch. It sounds like the title of a sci-fi novel, but it's actually referring to what's happening in data centers today.
It does sound dramatic, I agree, but it's an engineering term in this specific context. It refers to the exact moment where hardware physics, software architecture, and geopolitical strategy are all hitting their absolute limits simultaneously. They are converging on a single point of failure or a single point of breakthrough, depending on how optimistic you are today.
Well, that is exactly what we are here to figure out for you, the listener. We are going to spend the next hour unpacking this convergence epoch. We have the recent release of NVIDIA's Blackwell Ultra B300, which is, frankly, the specs just look like typos. We have the rise of what they're calling trillion parameter reasoning models, and we have massive geopolitical shifts. India entering the chat in a really big way, and the US tightening the screws on China.
And amidst all that noise, there is one very clear signal we need to isolate. It's a question that came up repeatedly in the literature this week. Are we moving too fast? Because we are building physical infrastructure that is dangerous, literally hot enough to melt silicon to run software that is rapidly becoming impossible to audit.
Right, that's the core tension. Is this new generation of reasoning AI just a tool, like a glorified calculator, or are we actually witnessing the birth of a new species of intelligence? And I know new species sounds hyperbolic, it sounds crazy, but we are going to get into the highly technical reasons why some incredibly sober researchers are using that exact language.
It's the tool versus species debate. And it's not just philosophy in a faculty lounge anymore. It's actively becoming a legal and national security crisis.
We have a ton of ground to cover today. We've got technical papers from MIT Future Tech on GPU progress. We have specific teardown reports on the new Blackwell B300. We have updates on India's Shakti Cloud and U.S. export controls. And for a splash of cold water, we have Michael Burry's latest financial moves against the entire AI sector.
Big Short 2.0.
Exactly. So let's start with the engine. Let's look at the actual hardware that is driving this entire conversation. The NVIDIA Blackwell Ultra B300. I was looking at the spec sheet you highlighted for me, and my very first reaction was that this doesn't look like a computer chip. It reads like the specs for an industrial furnace.
Thermally speaking, it essentially is a furnace. If you look at the GTC announcements that just dropped, the Blackwell Ultra B300 is pushing the absolute boundaries of what silicon packaging can tolerate.
Let's break down the numbers for everyone. What are we actually looking at here?
The headline number, the one keeping data center architects awake at night, is the power draw. A single B300 GPU draws approximately 1.4 kilowatts of continuous power.
Okay, 1.4 kilowatts. To the average listener, to me, that's just a number. Can you contextualize that?
Sure, think about a high-end hairdryer, or one of those portable ceramic space heaters you'd put under your desk in the dead of winter. Those usually max out at about 1,500 watts, so 1.5 kilowatts. So I want you to imagine a single computer chip, roughly the size of a coaster, radiating almost as much raw heat as a space heater running at full blast.
And these things aren't just sitting on a desk by themselves, they are packed into racks.
Right. A standard high-density server rack might hold 72 of these units. So imagine 72 space heaters shoved into a metal cabinet the size of your kitchen refrigerator, all of them running at maximum output, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
That seems, I mean, physics has rules. You just can't generate that much heat in that small of a physical space without something catching fire or melting.
You can't. Not with air. And this is the very first major takeaway of the B300 era. Air cooling is officially dead. The MIT Future Tech analysis we looked at was incredibly clear on this point. The power density of the B300 is roughly 2.2 to 3.1 times higher than a top-tier server CPU from just last year, like the Intel Xeon 697AP. It means you simply cannot blow enough cold air over the metal heatsink to keep the chip from destroying itself.
So the giant spinning fans we associate with server farms, those are gone.
The fans are gone. We are moving entirely to direct-to-chip liquid cooling. We are quite literally replumbing the internet. If you are a massive cloud operator and you built a state-of-the-art facility in 2024 with standard HVAC and air handlers, your multi-billion-dollar facility is now legacy. If you want to run the B300, you have to rip up the raised floorboards and install miles of liquid coolant piping.
That is a staggering capital expenditure. You're talking about retrofitting the entire physical layer of the global cloud infrastructure.
It is a massive undertaking, but they have absolutely no choice. And the reason they have no choice brings us to the second massive number on that spec sheet, 288 gigabytes.
That's the memory, right? The HBM3E.
High bandwidth memory, yes. The B300 comes equipped with 288 gigabytes of it stacked directly around the processor. The previous generation, the B200, only had 192 gigabytes. That is a massive generational jump in a very, very short window of time.
Why do we need that much memory on the chip itself? Because, my laptop runs perfectly fine with 16 gigs. Even a heavy gaming rig might only have 32 or 64. Why does an AI chip need nearly 300 gigs?
This gets right to the heart of the architectural bottleneck. The MIT analysis points out a fascinating divergence in Moore's law. We are all used to the idea that computers just magically get twice as fast every 2 years. But for AI GPUs, specifically regarding FP16 performance—
which is the half-precision math they use for deep learning, right?
Exactly. For that specific type of math, the raw compute performance is doubling every 1.44 years.
Wow, so the brain part of the chip is getting faster, much quicker than Moore's law ever predicted.
Much, much faster. We are physically accelerating. However, the connection, the actual wiring bandwidth between the memory chips and that super fast brain is only doubling every 3.5 years.
Oh, I see. So you have a super genius brain that can process the universe, but it's forced to read its data through a tiny little straw.
That is the perfect analogy. It's called a memory wall. The compute cores are just sitting there, burning power, sitting idle, waiting for the data to physically arrive from the memory banks. It's incredibly inefficient. The only way to solve this, since we hit a physical limit on making the wires between the chips any faster, is to put significantly more memory directly next to the brain. If you have 288 gigabytes, you can store the entire model, or at least the active parts, of a massive trillion-parameter model right there on the package. No fetching required.
So the B300 isn't just a faster chip. It's a custom-built solution designed specifically to hold these massive new reasoning models in its short-term memory so it never has to wait.
Precisely. It's a brute force engineering solution to an intractable physics problem. We can't move the data fast enough, so we're just making the chip's backpack much, much bigger. And to power that massive backpack, we have to pull 1.4 kilowatts and practically melt the electrical grid.
It really feels like we're just bludgeoning physics into submission here. But let's pivot to what this hardware is actually running. You mentioned reasoning models. In 2024 and 2025, the industry buzzword was all generative AI. Now, in early 2026, every single press release we read says reasoning. Is this just the marketing departments trying to sell more software, or is the architecture actually fundamentally different?
It is fundamentally architecturally different, and the difference lies entirely in how the system processes information. The sources describe a profound shift from System 1 thinking to System 2 thinking.
Daniel Kahneman's framework from psychology.
Right? System 1 is fast. It's instinctive. It's automatic. If I ask you right now, what is 2 plus 2? You don't calculate it. You don't perform math. You just instinctively know the answer is 4. That reflex is what generative AI, like the old GPT-4 models, was largely doing. It was predicting the next token based on statistical probability. It was a reflex engine.
A highly sophisticated autocorrect. And System 2.
System 2 is slow, it is deliberate, and it is logical. If I ask you, what is 17 times 24, you have to stop. Your brain shifts gears. You have to visualize the numbers. You multiply the 4 by the 7. You carry the 2. You are actively performing a logical sequence of steps.
You're doing actual work. You're holding state in your head.
You are thinking, and the new models, things like Kini K2 thinking, Ant Group's Lang 1T, and the DeepSeek Ring 2.5 series, they're designed specifically to do this. They engage in what developers are calling dynamic thinking time.
I've actually noticed this recently when I play with the new beta interfaces. You ask a really hard coding question, and it doesn't just start spitting out text instantly anymore. It sits there. It says thinking, sometimes for a full minute or two.
In the traditional software tech world, a 2-minute latency used to be a complete death sentence for a product. But now, it's the defining feature. During those 2 minutes, the model isn't just buffering or waiting for server capacity. It's actively exploring a tree of thoughts.
A tree of thoughts. Walk us through what that actually means under the hood.
Imagine a branching path of logic. The model looks at your complex prompt and tries pathway A. It computes a few steps down that path, and it realizes, wait, This logic leads to a mathematical contradiction, so it stops. It actively backtracks. It tries pathway B. It verifies the intermediate result against a known factual constraint. It effectively has an internal monologue, a digital scratch pad, where it works out the entire problem in private before it ever presents you with the final polished answer.
So it's fact-checking and self-correcting its own logic before it even speaks to the user.
Yes. And that is exactly what separates reasoning from generation. It's the ability to autonomously iterate on a thought process until it finds a logically sound conclusion.
But this immediately brings up a huge question of scale. We are talking about trillion parameter models. Kimi K2 is a trillion parameters. How on earth is it economically possible to run that? I mean, running a trillion mathematical calculations for every single word generated would bankrupt even the biggest tech companies in a matter of weeks.
That is exactly where the new software architecture comes in to save the day. This is the mixture of experts approach, or MOE. This is the absolute secret sauce of 2026 AI.
We hear MOE thrown around on every earnings call lately. Break it down for us. How does a mixture of experts model actually work?
The best way to understand it is to compare it to the old models. Think of the older, dense models as a single, overworked generalist. Imagine a single, massive brain where every single artificial neuron is connected to every other neuron. If you ask that dense model to write a silly limerick about a dog, the entire brain lights up. Even the neural pathways that know how to do advanced calculus, or how to fold a protein, or how to translate ancient Sumerian, they all activate to write a poem about a dog.
That sounds incredibly wasteful. It's like turning on the power for a whole city just to toast a piece of bread.
It is incredibly wasteful. It's energy inefficient and it's slow. Mixture of experts is an entirely different paradigm. Imagine, instead of one brain, a massive library filled with thousands of highly specialized experts. You have a math expert, a Python coding expert, a poetry expert, a European history expert.
And someone directing traffic, right? A receptionist.
Exactly, a mechanism called the router. When your prompt comes in, let's say you ask, write me a Python script to scrape financial data from this website. The router looks at that prompt and says, okay, I only need to send this to the coding expert and the logic expert. The poetry expert stays completely asleep. The history expert stays asleep.
So you aren't paying the compute cost for the whole brain.
Exactly. Kimi K2 might have 1 trillion parameters in total. That's the massive size of the library itself. But for any given input, the router might only activate 32 billion parameters. This technique is called sparse activation.
So you get the vast, comprehensive knowledge base of a giant world-class model, but the running cost and speed of a much smaller model.
Correct. And that's the only physical reason the massive B300 hardware ecosystem even makes sense. You need that massive 288 gigabytes of HBM3E memory to store all the sleeping experts so they are ready at a moment's notice, but you only need the compute power to run the active ones.
Okay, that makes total sense economically and architecturally, but it introduces a really weird, almost unsettling concept. If 95% of this massive digital brain is sleeping at any given time, what exactly is happening in the dark parts of the model?
That is the ultimate security nightmare, and it's exactly what the MIT Future Tech papers highlighted with bright red flags.
The dark corners of the neural net.
Right. When you have a traditional dense model, everything lights up all the time. So during your safety testing phase, you can generally observe how the entire system behaves. You can see its biases and its guardrails. But with a sparsely activated MOE model, you have vast dark swaths of the model that might remain entirely inactive for 99.9% of normal user prompts.
So what if someone purposely hid something in those dark corners?
That's the great fear right now. A hacker or a rogue developer, or honestly, even an anomaly in the massive unsupervised training process itself, could embed what security researchers call a sleeper agent into those deeply inactive parameters. The model would behave perfectly, cleanly, and safely for every single safety benchmark test you run, because none of those standard tests trigger that specific rare combination of experts. But if a bad actor inputs a highly specific, nonsensical string of text, a trigger phrase, it suddenly wakes up that malicious expert pathway.
And suddenly your helpful coding assistant is actively helping a terrorist group build a biological weapon or quietly exfiltrating sensitive bank routing numbers into a dark web server.
And the terrifying part is you couldn't possibly detect it beforehand because the attack surface is simply too vast. You physically cannot test every possible permutation of 1 trillion parameters. It's statistically impossible. We are quite literally deploying massive alien brains that have digital caves we cannot ever explore.
That is, well, That is deeply not comforting. And I think it leads us directly into the philosophical and increasingly practical debate of this deep dive, the whole new species argument. Because if this system has hidden depths and it has internal monologue, and it can reason and self-correct, is it still a tool, or is it something else entirely?
This is the great divide in the computer science community right now. And I want to be incredibly clear for the listener. This isn't just late-night sci-fi speculation. This exact debate is happening right now in corporate boardrooms, in the halls of the Pentagon, and across international regulatory agencies.
Let's ground this by looking at the tool argument first, because I think it's important to remember what these systems actually are at a mathematical level. There was a highly specific test mentioned in the source material, the maze test, that heavily suggests these things are actually still quite brittle, maybe even kind of stupid in certain ways.
The maze test is a fantastic reality check. Researchers took GPT-5 and Codex High, which are models that are absolute savants at writing complex back-end code and translating obscure languages. And they gave them a simple ASCII-based visual maze, like the kind of placemat maze you give a child at a diner. Move the cursor from A to B without hitting a wall.
And how did these trillion-parameter geniuses do?
They failed spectacularly.
They couldn't solve a child's placemat maze.
They struggled significantly, even utilizing their fancy new System 2 thinking time, spending actual minutes of compute analyzing the problem. They couldn't reliably find the valid path from A to B without hallucinating moves right through the solid walls.
Why is that? If a model can write a flawless Linux kernel driver, why can't it navigate a simple 2D maze?
Because fundamentally, they do not possess innate spatial reasoning.
Oh.
They don't see walls, they don't experience physical reality, they only see tokens. They're still just predicting the next mathematical word in a sequence. They tried to linguistically reason their way out of a geometric maze using text logic, but a maze is a spatial problem, not a linguistic one.
So the tool argument says, look, calm down, everyone. It's just a massive pattern matcher. It has zero common sense. It has absolutely no grounding in the physical, real world. It's basically a supercalculator that's terrible at basic geometry.
Exactly. It's a narrow algorithmic optimizer. It is not an AGI. It is not a general intelligence with worldly awareness.
Okay, I fully buy that argument. It keeps things grounded, but then we turn the page in the research and we get to the species argument. And this is where the Kimi K2 data gets a little spooky. We really need to talk about tool orchestration.
This is the counterargument, and it is a very, very strong one. Kimi K2 isn't just sitting in a chat box answering user trivia questions. The operational data shows it can autonomously execute 200 to 300 sequential discrete tool calls to complete a single high-level workflow.
Let's unpack that for the listener. Sequential tool calls, what does that actually look like in practice for a developer?
Okay, imagine you are a software manager and you tell the AI agent, audit this massive open source code library for security vulnerabilities, and if you find any, fix them and push the update. That is a very high-level, vague goal.
Right. In the old days, which means like 2025, the AI would just write out a text plan for you. It would say, step 1, you should check the code. Step 2, you should run a linter.
But Kimi K2 actually does the work itself. Step 1, it autonomously opens a web browser to find the correct repository. Step 2, it spins up a terminal and clones the code to a virtual environment. Step 3, it reads the developer documentation. Step 4, it writes a custom Python script to test the code base for bugs. Step 5, it executes its own script.
And here is the absolutely crucial part that the sources focus on. What happens if that test script fails?
That is the new species moment. That right there. If the script errors out and crashes, the model doesn't stop and ask the human what to do. It reads its own error log. It thinks, I imported the wrong legacy library in line 42. It opens the code editor. It rewrites the code. It runs the compiler again. It verifies the fix. It formats the final security report. It performs this massive loop of action, observation, and correction over 300 times in a row.
Without a human ever clicking continue or approving a prompt.
Completely autonomously from start to finish.
See, that feels like true agency. That feels significantly less like a fancy Microsoft Excel spreadsheet and way more like I just hired an incredibly fast digital intern.
Or an alien agent. When a software system can actively pursue a vague goal through novel obstacles, critically correcting its own behavior along the way, and interacting with the live internet hundreds of times without human supervision, the line between a static tool and an autonomous entity gets incredibly blurry.
And the truly scary part goes back to that latent space we talked about earlier, right? The actual human developers at Kimi didn't explicitly program every single one of those 300 specific steps.
No, they absolutely didn't. They just trained it on a mountain of raw data, gave it a reward function, And this profound capability emerged on its own, its emergent behavior. The model figured out how to chain these disparate software tools together to solve novel problems.
Hmm.
We didn't teach it how to be an autonomous agent. We simply gave it a large enough brain, and it became one.
So to recap where we are, we have a system that can pause to think for minutes, take hundreds of unprompted actions in the real world, and possesses emergent capabilities nobody explicitly coded, which naturally brings us to the massive crisis in global regulation. Because how on earth do you police a system like that?
That is the governance gap. And honestly, right now, it's looking more like a bottomless canyon.
It's not like the government is totally asleep at the wheel.
Hmm.
We do have new laws. California SB 53, the Transparency and Frontier Artificial Intelligence Act, literally just went into effect last month, January 1st, 2026.
It did. And it places heavy mandates on AI companies. It requires strict explainability logs, continuous bias testing, and red teaming. On paper, to a politician, it looks like a very robust safety framework.
But in the reality of the server room,
In reality, it's a pure bandwidth problem. Think back to that Kimi K2 coding example we just discussed. It took 300 autonomous steps. It browsed the web, wrote custom code, deleted code, checked error logs, compiled binaries. That single 5-minute task generates an explainability log file the size of a Tolstoy novel for one single user interaction.
and there are tens of millions of these interactions happening across the globe every single hour.
Exactly. Who is reading those logs? Are we hiring an army of human auditors? It takes an expert human programmer several hours just to untangle and understand what the AI did in those 5 minutes. The government bureaucracy operates at human speed. The AI agent operates at silicon speed.
So the new regulation basically just says, show your work. But the volume of the work is so incomprehensibly massive that no human being could ever actually verify it.
We are effectively relying entirely on the honor system with massive black boxes. We are building and deploying systems that operate vastly faster and much deeper than our biological ability to monitor them.
And that circles us right back to the MOE security risk we discussed. If we can't physically audit the action logs and we can't mathematically check the dark corners of the mixture of experts' brain, we're essentially flying completely blind.
We are trusting that the alien in the box is friendly, simply because we currently lack the scientific tools to verify if it isn't.
Well, some nations look at that equation and decide they aren't willing to take that bet. They don't want to blindly trust a black box that was built and trained by a corporation in San Francisco, which shifts us into the geopolitics of compute, this massive new race for sovereign AI.
This was the totally inevitable reaction to the trust issue. If you're a foreign government and you can't audit the American model and you can't control its guardrails, you have to build your own.
And India is making a truly historic move here. I was reading the source materials about Yada Data Services and their new Shakti Cloud initiative.
This is a massive geopolitical story that really didn't get enough mainstream press in the West. On February 18th, Yeta officially announced a $2 billion massive expansion to their data centers.
$2 billion. That is serious nation-state level money.
And look specifically at what they're buying with that money. 20,736 NVIDIA Blackwell Ultra GPUs. All of them liquid-cooled.
Just doing the quick math in my head on what we talked about earlier. 20,000 chips, each pulling 1.4 kilowatts. That's nearly 30 megawatts of continuous power just for the GPUs, not even counting the cooling pumps or the network switches. That is a staggering amount of compute. That's an arsenal.
It is an arsenal. And the explicit stated goal of the Indian government here is sovereign AI. The leadership in New Delhi has realized that absolute dependence on foreign compute power and foreign AI models is a critical strategic vulnerability in the 21st century. They want Indian cultural data, staying securely inside Indian data centers, training custom Indian reasoning models on physical infrastructure that they own and control.
It makes complete sense. If artificial intelligence is essentially the new electricity or, frankly, the new nuclear deterrent, you absolutely do not want your primary power plant located in a different country.
Especially a country that has recently shown a willingness to use hardware export controls as an economic weapon. Which brings us squarely to the ongoing tension between the U.S. and China.
Right, the framework for artificial intelligence diffusion.
Released by the U.S. in January 2025, the Commerce Department is using a highly specific technical metric called TPP Total Processing Performance to draw a hard line in the silicon sand.
How does this TPP metric actually work? Because it seems complicated.
It's basically a mathematical formula that combines the raw calculation speed of the chip with its memory density. If a hardware chip crosses a certain high TPP threshold, it is legally classified as a restricted technology and cannot be exported to China. The strategic goal is very clear: to permanently freeze China's AI development at a specific older performance level.
It's essentially saying, you must be this slow to ride the ride.
Effectively, yes. But the intelligence sources highlight a fascinating engineering workaround that is happening right now in Shenzhen.
There is always a workaround when billions of dollars are on the line. What are they doing?
China, specifically leading AI labs like DeepSeek, cannot legally purchase the new B300s. So what do? They pivot. They buy tens of thousands of older unrestricted chips, the H800s. Chips that are technically allowed through customs because their individual performance falls just under the US TPP limit.
But those older chips are significantly slower. They can't run these massive reasoning models efficiently.
Individually, no, they are weak. But DeepSeek is fiercely innovating on the software layer instead of the hardware layer. They're writing incredibly complex code that perfectly parallelizes the AI workload across tens of thousands of these weaker chips with unprecedented network efficiency.
So the US bans them from buying the massive Ferrari engine, and China's response is to figure out how to strap 20 Honda Civic engines together so flawlessly that the car still goes 200 miles an hour.
That is exactly what they are doing. They are using pure software optimization to bridge the physical hardware gap created by the sanctions.
But is it actually working? Can software really overcome a raw physics disadvantage?
To a certain extent, yes. DeepSeek's models are remarkably competitive, but the absolute hardware gap is still very real. The strategic analysis suggests there is still an overall performance gap of roughly 23.6x between the US and its allied nations versus the restricted nations.
23.6x, that is a massive chasm. In tech terms, that's the difference between dial-up internet and fiber optics.
It is a huge advantage. But that gap only persists if the export controls hold perfectly tight, and crucially, if the underlying reasoning models don't get so highly optimized that they can suddenly run on a potato. It's a constant high-stakes arms race between Washington's hardware restrictions and Beijing's software innovation.
So let's take a breath and recap the board here, because it's a lot. We have hardware that is so powerful it's melting the electrical grid. We have software that is increasingly acting like a new autonomous species. We have a regulatory system that is totally blind to what's happening. And we have a massive multi-billion-dollar geopolitical arms race. It really feels like this entire AI rocket ship is only going up and faster every day.
That is definitely the prevailing consensus view in Silicon Valley.
But not everyone agrees. We have to talk about the massive skeptic in the room, the guy betting against the rocket ship.
Oh, Michael Burry.
The man who famously predicted the 2008 housing crash. He is back in the news. And he is betting heavily against the AI boom. Cyan Asset Management just revealed a massive position over $1 billion against NVIDIA and Palantir.
It's an incredibly bold bet. Every single institution on Wall Street is buying with both hands, and he is aggressively selling.
Why? What does he possibly see in the data that the rest of the market is completely missing?
His core argument boils down to a concept some analysts are calling economic thermodynamics.
I really love that phrase. Economic thermodynamics. What does it actually mean in this context?
It's all about the vicious cycle of hardware depreciation. We just spent 20 minutes raving about how mind-blowingly amazing the Blackwell Ultra B300 is.
Because it is amazing. It's an engineering marvel.
It is. But think deeply about what the existence of the B300 means for the cloud provider that just bought 50,000 B200s 6 months ago, or the company that mortgaged their future to buy H100s just a year ago.
Oh, right. They spent tens of billions of dollars on bleeding-edge hardware that is now essentially second tier.
Its legacy. Burry's entire argument is that the underlying technology is improving entirely too fast for the economics to work. The depreciation rate of these assets is vertical. Companies are spending historic astronomical amounts of capital capex to build giant data centers full of H100s. But before those incredibly expensive chips can generate enough actual software profit to pay for themselves, the B300 comes out and crushes them in efficiency.
And suddenly, your state-of-the-art billion-dollar data center is obsolete, and you have to buy all new chips just to stay relevant.
Exactly. You are trapped on a financial treadmill that is constantly speeding up. The question Burry is asking is simple. Can these AI companies actually generate enough real-world revenue from these reasoning models to justify doing a complete multi-billion-dollar hardware refresh every 18 months?
That is the capex wall.
Burry strongly believes the answer is no. He thinks the actual end-user revenue, the actual utility everyday people are willing to pay for, isn't growing nearly as fast as the sheer cost of the hardware infrastructure. He thinks we are in a massive infrastructure bubble fueled entirely by corporate FOMO.
And there's another ceiling mentioned in the report that ties directly into this economic skepticism, the data ceiling.
Yes, and honestly, for the AI engineers, this might be the much bigger long-term problem. We are literally running out of internet.
What do you mean running out of internet?
We have basically trained these massive foundational models on every single high-quality book, news article, Reddit post, and code repository available in the public domain. The data scientists estimate that we will completely exhaust the global stock of high-quality public text data by late 2026.
So we can build a much faster engine, the B300, but we literally won't have any more high-octane fuel to put into it to make it smarter.
Exactly. Unless we perfectly figure out synthetic data, which means having the AI generate text to teach itself, which carries massive risks of what they call model collapse, where the AI just reinforces its own hallucinations, or unless massive corporations start unlocking their private proprietary data vaults, the fundamental progress might just stall. The exponential capability curve might flatten out precisely at the moment when we are spending the most capital to sustain it.
That is the ultimate bear case. Vertical hardware depreciation, crushing capital costs, and a massive data shortage hitting all at once. It's a very compelling, sobering argument.
It acts as a necessary counterweight. It balances out the whole new species hype with some cold, hard, inescapable financial reality.
It really does. So we have thoroughly covered the landscape today. We are deep in the convergence epoch, February 2026. We have liquid-cooled silicon brains, reasoning software that acts like an autonomous agent, massive regulatory panic, sovereign AI nationalism, and Michael Burry betting $1 billion that the whole thing comes crashing down.
It is a tremendous amount of structural change to process.
Let's synthesize this for the listener before we wrap up. Why should they care about the memory wall or sparse activation? What does this entire epoch mean for the regular person driving to work right now?
I think ultimately it all boils down to one single word: trust.
Trust.
We are crossing a permanent threshold in human history. We now have the physical hardware, the B300, and the software architecture Kimi K2 and Moe 2 to create genuinely semi-autonomous agents.
Yeah.
Digital entities that can go out into the real world and perform 300 sequential actions on your behalf.
Right. They can do our jobs.
But the core bottleneck to adopting this technology isn't compute power anymore. We have plenty of raw compute. The true bottleneck is whether you, as a human being, can trust a digital black box that burns 1.4 kilowatts of power to silently think for 5 minutes and then make 300 unsupervised decisions with your data.
Because if it hallucinates or makes a critical logic error on step 150 of 300, does it bankrupt your small business? Does it accidentally leak your private medical records to a public repo?
Exactly. Can we audit the alien? Because if we can't accurately predict its behavior and we can't read its mind, then the actual societal utility of these incredible tools is strictly limited by our very rational fear of them. The next few years aren't just about making the silicon chips faster. They are fundamentally about figuring out how to safely coexist with an intelligence system we no longer fully comprehend.
That is the new species problem in a nutshell. You don't program a species, you coexist with it.
Res-
So, keeping all of that in mind, here is a final provocative thought for everyone listening today. Something to mull over. If we are actively building infrastructure that scales vastly faster than Moore's law, and we are deploying software that reasons and self-corrects in dark pathways we can't fully audit, are we actually still the architects of this intelligence? Or have we unknowingly just become the biological bootloader for it?
That is the defining philosophical question of the 21st century.
Something heavy to chew on. Check your data lineage, stay endlessly curious, and maybe keep an industrial fire extinguisher handy if you happen to be racking any B300s this weekend. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
Goodbye, everyone.